You have been told that the ego is the enemy because the mind prefers a battle it can imagine winning. It is easier to picture a false self that must be destroyed than to face the deeper fact that the self you are trying to destroy is also the self performing the destruction. The seeker says, I must kill my ego, without noticing that the voice making this declaration is already organizing itself around conquest, purity, superiority, and arrival. The ego does not disappear inside that project. It simply learns to wear the clothing of the one who believes they have transcended it. This is why ego death so often becomes another achievement placed upon the inner shelf. A person once took pride in wealth, beauty, intelligence, status, or control, and then begins taking pride in detachment, humility, spiritual knowledge, or freedom from identity. The object of pride changes while the structure producing pride remains untouched. What once said, I am more important than others, may later say, I am less identified than others. The language becomes sacred while the movement underneath it remains familiar. The error begins with imagining the ego as a separate creature living inside you. You picture it as an intruder, a parasite, the shadowy opponent standing between you and awakening. Yet the ego is not an object that can be located and removed. It is a continuous activity through which experience is arranged around a center called me. It is the mind identifying what belongs to this center, what threatens it, what confirms it, what diminishes it, and what story must be told to preserve its continuity. That activity is not automatically evil. Without some organizing center, ordinary human life would become nearly impossible to navigate. You need to distinguish your body from another body, your responsibilities from someone else's responsibilities, your memories from events you did not experience, and the commitments you made from those you did not make. You need enough identity to answer when your name is called, and enough continuity to remember why you entered a room. The ego is not merely vanity. It is also one of the ways consciousness coordinates a finite human life. Because vanity is loud, people mistake it for the entire mechanism. They notice arrogance, defensiveness, selfishness, jealousy, or the hunger to be admired and call all of this ego. Then they assume that removing these behaviors would remove the ego itself. But a quieter ego may be operating through restraint, politeness, silence, self-denial, or the desire never to appear selfish. One person demands attention directly, while another arranges every gesture around appearing as though they need no attention at all. The second person may look more evolved because the performance is harder to detect. They do not interrupt, boast, or openly compete, yet they monitor whether others recognize their patience. They offer help while secretly noticing who failed to thank them. They refuse praise while hoping the refusal will be interpreted as humility. Their ego has not died. It has become sophisticated enough to receive nourishment from invisibility. This is the first collapse in the ego death narrative. The one attempting to kill the ego cannot stand outside the mechanism being judged. Every strategy you create is shaped by the identity you currently inhabit. Every standard of purity is interpreted by the same mind that wants to become pure. Every victory is announced within the inner world of the victor. The project therefore contains a contradiction from the beginning, because the executioner and the condemned are movements of the same structure. You may notice this in moments when you try to force yourself not to care. Someone criticizes you, excludes you, misunderstands you, or fails to recognize what you contributed. The reaction appears, and then another voice enters to condemn the reaction. I should be above this. Now there are two layers of conflict rather than one. There is the original hurt, and there is the spiritual identity that feels ashamed for having been hurt. The second layer often creates more suffering than the first. Hurt may have passed through the body in a few minutes if it had been honestly felt. Instead, it becomes evidence that you have failed to transcend yourself. You begin watching the reaction, resisting it, judging it, hiding it, and constructing explanations for why it should not exist. The ego is then strengthened by the very effort intended to remove it, because identity becomes increasingly invested in controlling what may appear within experience. The desire for ego death is frequently a desire to escape vulnerability. You want a state in which rejection cannot reach you, uncertainty cannot disturb you, loss cannot rearrange you, and humiliation cannot enter the inner chamber. You may call this liberation, but part of you is asking for invulnerability. You do not merely want freedom from illusion, you want freedom from being human enough to be affected. This desire is understandable because the ego is often blamed for every wound attached to identity. If there were no sense of self, perhaps nothing could be insulted, abandoned, compared, or diminished. Yet the wish to become untouchable is itself organized around protecting the self from pain. The self imagines its final safety will be achieved by disappearing. Even its fantasy of non-existence is secretly a strategy for survival. This is why dramatic experiences do not settle the matter. A person may enter meditation, crisis, psychedelic intensity, grief, awe, or deep surrender and temporarily lose the ordinary boundaries of identity. The familiar center may dissolve, time may disappear, and the separation between self and world may no longer feel real. Such an experience can be profound. But when ordinary functioning returns, the organizing activity returns with it, because a temporary absence of self-reference is not the permanent destruction of self-organization. The mind may then convert the experience into a new identity. It says, "I experienced ego death," and begins measuring others against the depth of what occurred. The event that briefly removed the center becomes material through which the center redefines itself. Memory turns the dissolution into biography. Biography turns it into status. And status allows the ego to claim ownership of the moment in which ownership appeared to vanish. Nothing about this means the experience was false. It means the interpretation may be incomplete. A window can open without the house being destroyed. A person can glimpse awareness without its usual boundaries and still return to a personality with preferences, fears, habits, and unresolved history. The mistake is not in honoring the glimpse. The mistake is in declaring that the mechanism of identity has permanently died because its activity briefly became silent. The deeper question is not whether the ego can be killed, but whether it can be seen while it is operating. Destruction requires an enemy, while seeing requires attention. Destruction divides the inner world into what is allowed to remain and what must be eliminated. Seeing does not begin by choosing sides. It observes the formation of the sides themselves. When you are praised, can you notice the self expanding without immediately feeding it or condemning it? When you are criticized, can you notice the rapid construction of defense, explanation, counterattack, withdrawal, or self-blame? When another person succeeds, can you feel admiration and contraction existing in the same body without creating a noble story about one and a shameful story about the other? This kind of observation is more demanding than declaring war. War permits certainty, but observation asks you to remain present without turning what you see into a verdict. The ego survives through unconscious identification more than through mere existence. A thought says, "They do not respect me." And you do not experience it as a thought appearing. You experience it as reality revealing itself. Emotion rises, memory selects supporting evidence, imagination predicts future injury, and the body prepares for defense. Within seconds, an entire world forms around a sentence that was never examined. To see the ego is to notice how quickly experience becomes personal territory. A delayed message becomes a statement about your worth. Another person's mood becomes proof that you did something wrong. A disagreement becomes a threat to who you believe yourself to be. The mind does not simply register events. It places you at the center of their meaning and then reacts to the meaning it created. This does not happen only in pain. Pleasure is also gathered into identity. You receive attention and immediately wonder how to preserve the version of yourself that received it. You create something beautiful and begin fearing that the next creation will fail to confirm the same image. You help someone and quietly store the event as evidence of being good. The ego does not only defend against what diminishes the self, it also attempts to possess whatever enlarges it. The attempt to kill the ego intensifies possession because it creates the most exalted identity available, the one who has moved beyond identity. This identity can be difficult to question because every challenge is interpreted as evidence that others remain unconscious. The person may become unreachable while calling themselves open, rigid while calling themselves surrendered, and dismissive while calling themselves detached. Their certainty becomes protected by spiritual language, and any discomfort is projected onto the supposed ignorance of those around them. Here, the contradiction becomes dangerous rather than merely philosophical. When people believe they have transcended ego, they may stop examining the harm they cause. Apology begins to feel unnecessary because they identify with awareness rather than personality. Accountability is treated as a lower level concern, and emotional consequences are dismissed as attachment. The claim of egolessness then becomes shelter for the parts of the self least willing to be seen. A healthy relationship to ego does not require worshiping it or obeying every demand it makes. It requires placing it inside a larger field of awareness where its movements can be recognized without becoming the whole of reality. You can have a self without believing the self is the source of everything you are. You can use identity without allowing identity to interpret every moment as a referendum on its survival. You can participate in personality without mistaking personality for the total depth of consciousness. This changes the aim from death to transparency. The ego becomes less powerful not because it disappears, but because its movements are no longer hidden behind unquestioned certainty. Defensiveness may still arise, but you recognize the fear beneath it before building a fortress around the reaction. Pride may still appear, but you do not need to turn it into superiority or punish yourself for feeling it. Identity continues to function, yet it becomes increasingly permeable to truth. The strange freedom is that you do not become free by finally defeating yourself. You become freer when the inner war no longer determines the shape of your attention. The ego cannot successfully murder the ego, but awareness can reveal the conflict through which ego keeps recreating itself. What you call the enemy was partly a function, partly a wound, partly a habit, and partly a story repeated so often that it felt like a permanent owner. Once those movements are seen clearly, the question is no longer how to kill the self, but how to stop mistaking every movement of self for the whole of what you are. Even transparency can become another flattering image of the self. The person who no longer claims to have killed the ego may instead claim to be the one who sees it clearly. They become proud of noticing their defensiveness, skilled at naming their patterns, and increasingly certain that observation has placed them beyond the movements being observed. What once said, "I have transcended the ego," now says, "I am aware of the ego." The language is more accurate, but the position of superiority may remain almost untouched. This unsettles the comfort of believing that awareness alone resolves identification. You may see a pattern and still obey it. You may describe your wound with precision and still organize an entire relationship around protecting it. You may recognize envy while continuing to undermine the person you envy, or identify fear while allowing fear to choose every important direction. Seeing is necessary, but the part that sees can be recruited into the same identity structure it believes it has illuminated. The observer can become the ego's safest hiding place. It stands slightly behind experience and quietly says, "Look how conscious I am of what is happening." It converts pain into analysis before pain has entered the body, and converts accountability into self-description before behavior has changed. The person becomes fluent in the vocabulary of their own conditioning while remaining governed by it. Their insight is genuine, but insight has become a substitute for transformation. This is why some people can explain exactly why they behave as they do and still repeat the behavior without interruption. They know their attachment pattern, their childhood wound, their defense style, and the trigger that activates it. The explanation arrives so quickly that it creates the sensation of movement. Yet the next conflict follows the old path. The same words are spoken, the same withdrawal occurs, and the same person is left carrying the consequence. Knowledge has entered the story without entering the reflex. The ego is not weakened merely because it has been accurately described. A prison does not open because the prisoner can draw its floor plan. Description can even make the prison feel more sophisticated, because now the person identifies not only with the wound, but with being someone who understands the wound. They may begin protecting the explanation as fiercely as they once protected the original behavior. Any interpretation that asks more of them feels like a threat to the self they built from self-knowledge. This introduces a deeper problem. There may be no single ego standing behind your actions at all. The language of the ego makes the mechanism sound unified, as though one internal authority makes decisions and defends one stable identity. Yet different selves appear under different conditions, each carrying its own fears, loyalties, memories, and definitions of survival. The self that speaks gently in solitude may disappear when challenged, while the self that appears during conflict may feel like the only honest version of you. You may promise something sincerely in one emotional state and violate it sincerely in another. The person who made the promise was not necessarily lying. They simply could not feel the priorities of the self who would later become afraid, tempted, angry, or ashamed. Human identity is less like a ruler sitting on a throne and more like a shifting coalition whose members take power according to circumstance. What you call ego may be the temporary government formed by whichever needs become strongest in the moment. This makes the project of transparency more difficult than it first appeared. Who is becoming transparent to whom? The calm observer may clearly see the defensive self after the conflict has ended, but that observer may not be present when the defense takes control. The reflective self writes wise conclusions at night, while the frightened self wakes in the morning and experiences those conclusions as distant ideas. Awareness that exists only after the event may explain your life without yet being able to participate in it. You have likely experienced this division when you knew better and still could not act from what you knew. One part of you understood that the conversation required patience, while another felt the rising urgency to be right. One part knew that silence would prevent damage, while another believed silence would mean surrender. By the time the wiser understanding returned, the words had already been spoken. The regret was real, but so was the temporary disappearance of the self who would have chosen differently. To say, "I was not myself," is both true and untrue. You were not the version of yourself you prefer to recognize, but the version that appeared was not a foreign intruder. It carried your history, your learned protections, your unmet needs, and your body's expectation of danger. Rejecting it as unreal only ensures that it will remain unexamined until the next time it takes control. What you disown does not become less yours. It becomes less available to conscious relationship. This is the second destabilization. You may not be able to stand outside identity because the one attempting to stand outside is also a state-dependent self. The witness you trust may be strongest only when you are safe, rested, praised, or alone. Under humiliation, exhaustion, abandonment, or threat, a different center may form and reinterpret the entire world. The truths that felt obvious in peace may become inaccessible in pain. Consciousness remains, but your access to its wider field may narrow until survival feels like the only truth present. The body participates in this narrowing before philosophy can intervene. A tone of voice resembles an earlier danger. The chest tightens, the breath shortens, and attention begins selecting evidence of threat. The mind then creates a narrative that makes the bodily state seem rational and inevitable. You believe you are responding to the present person, but the present person has entered a courtroom whose laws were written long before they arrived. Ego in this form is not merely a thought about yourself. It is an embodied prediction about what must happen next. This is why telling yourself that you are not your ego may have little power during the moments when identification is most complete. The sentence belongs to a broader state of awareness, But the threatened system hears only an abstraction. It does not need a teaching. It believes it needs protection. Its urgency is not defeated by being called illusory, because the body experiences the threat as immediate. The more forcefully you attempt to transcend it, the more evidence it receives that something dangerous is occurring inside you. A frightened identity does not soften because it has lost an argument. It softens when the conditions sustaining its alarm begin to change. Sometimes this requires breath, time, distance, rest, grief, repair, boundaries, or the presence of someone who does not intensify the threat. Sometimes it requires admitting that a situation truly is unsafe, rather than using spiritual language to endure what should be left. Awareness is not passive acceptance of every condition. It must become capable of distinguishing an old alarm from a present danger. The ego death narrative often fails here because it treats all self protection as illusion. A person learns to distrust anger, preference, resistance, and the impulse to withdraw. They assume that every boundary is ego and every surrender is awakening. This can make them easier to manipulate because they have been taught that defending themselves proves they are still identified. Their spiritual ideal begins working on behalf of the very people or systems that benefit from their silence. There are moments when the self must become more defined before it can become more transparent. Someone who has spent years adapting to others may not need less identity. They may need enough identity to discover what they actually feel. Someone trained to remain agreeable may need to experience the unfamiliar solidity of saying no. Someone whose needs were repeatedly dismissed may need to name those needs without apologizing for having them. The expansion of selfhood can be a movement toward truth rather than away from it. This does not mean every impulse deserves obedience. It means dissolution is not medicine for every distortion. A rigid self may need loosening, while a fragmented self may need coherence. An inflated self may need proportion, while a neglected self may need recognition. The same spiritual instruction can liberate one person and erase another, because the structure receiving the instruction is not the same. The desire to be free of ego can conceal an unwillingness to develop a mature one. It may be easier to speak of oneness than to keep a promise, easier to dissolve into universal love than to remain present during an uncomfortable conversation. It may be easier to say that no one is separate than to recognize how your behavior affects a particular person. Transcendent language can lift you above the unfinished labor of character. The infinite becomes a refuge from the specific. Character is where insight acquires weight. It is formed when awareness remains available during inconvenience, not merely during contemplation. It appears when you tell the truth, though the truth threatens your image, when you repair damage without centering your shame, and when you tolerate being misunderstood without immediately manufacturing an enemy. These acts do not destroy identity, they educate it. A mature ego does not need to be the center of every room, but neither does it need to vanish from the room. It can recognize its preferences without turning them into universal law. It can receive criticism without collapsing into worthlessness or rising into retaliation. It can admit limitation without interpreting limitation as annihilation. Its strength lies not in dominating experience, but in remaining coherent enough to participate without possessing everything it touches. This coherence changes how the inner parts relate to one another. The frightened self no longer has to seize complete control because its fear can be heard before it becomes a command. The proud self does not have to be humiliated into silence because its hunger for recognition can be acknowledged without being placed in charge. The grieving self does not have to perform productivity while carrying a loss the rest of the system refuses to feel. Identity becomes less tyrannical when its divided movements are permitted to enter relationship. The larger awareness is therefore not a throne from which the ego is watched. It is the capacity in which competing selves, bodily states, memories, and present realities can be held without one of them becoming the absolute definition of the moment. This capacity does not always feel serene. At times it feels like enduring contradiction without rushing to choose the most comforting story. It asks you to remain with the part that wants revenge and the part that wants peace until you can act from something deeper than either impulse alone. Here the three movements begin to meet. Observation without transformation is incomplete. Identity is multiple rather than singular. And healthy selfhood cannot always be reached through dissolution. Together, they overturn the easy belief that freedom comes from stepping outside the ego and watching it disappear. There may be no permanent outside, no single ego to remove, and no universal virtue in becoming less defined. What matters is whether the structures of identity become more conscious, more integrated, more responsive to reality, and less dependent on distortion for survival. You are not your ego, but this does not mean your ego is unrelated to you. It contains adaptations shaped by what you endured, capacities formed by what you practiced, and stories created to preserve continuity when life became difficult to understand. Some of those stories must be questioned, some protections must be retired, and some identities must be allowed to end. Yet ending an identity is not the same as killing the function through which human experience takes form. The death you imagine may be a series of relinquishments rather than one final disappearance. What dies is sometimes the certainty that you must be seen a particular way. What dies is the belief that pain proves your unworthiness, that control guarantees safety, or that being wrong threatens your existence. What dies is the contract you made with an earlier world in which a certain mask was necessary. The organizing self remains, but it no longer has to organize life around the same emergency. It can become an instrument rather than an unquestioned master. And still, even the word instrument must be held carefully, because it suggests that there is a separate user standing behind the self and operating it. The deeper truth may be less comfortable. Consciousness does not simply possess a human identity from a distance. It enters the limits, habits, relationships, and consequences of that identity from within. You do not awaken by escaping the person you became. You awaken as the capacity to meet that person so completely that neither worship nor destruction is required.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.